Beware the Ides of March. Well met, friends. I am Barkeyus. Better watch out, ladies. All I have on is a toga. Fellow citizens, I am here to acquaint you with Julius Caesar, the tale of his divinity, the noble and mighty Caesar and his downfall, as penned by that illustrious scribe, William Shakespeare. Our story goeth likest this. It's the year 44 BC, and Caesar has just returned to Rome after ending a civil war stirred up by Pompey, a Roman general. Caesar enters Rome in triumph, which would have been cool since that's what they did after a war, except it wasn't some other country Caesar conquered, but fellow Romans. This doesn't sit well with some of the nobles. On top of that, they fear Caesar wants to become the supreme ultra-dude emperor king, grabbing more power for himself. So Cassius and his pals hatch a scheme to remove Caesar and take over. But they know they can't act without Brutus. Brutus was popular with the people and a good friend of Caesar, and he held the good of Rome above all else. Cassius talks Brutus into going along with the plan by appealing to his love of Rome. So, not such a good friend after all, am I right? And take note, Brutus was not the villain of the piece. Cassius was. He was the one that stirred things up and puts the bee in Brutus's bonnet. There are several premonitions of danger, a big storm. Caesar's wife has a nightmare that Caesar is murdered, and, most famous of all, a soothsayer tells Caesar to beware the Ides of March. The Ides of March is when a full moon happens in the month of March, but that's not the only time that happens. It can be in other months too. Anyway, this is March, and there's an Ides, and Caesar is warned to watch out. Despite all this, Caesar trots off to the Senate of Rome, hoping to be crowned ultra-dude by the senators. This is where the conspirators have laid their plans to turn Caesar into a human pincushion, which they do, including Brutus, with the unkindest cut of all. Thus the origin of the famous line, "Et tu, Brute?" or "You too, Brutus?" The killers then wash their hands in the blood of Caesar and go forth to proclaim what they did and why, figuring the people would be cool with all this since Brutus is on board, and they did it for Rome. Really, they did it for themselves. Now we can talk about another dude, Marc Antony. Yes, the guy who was boinking Cleopatra, but that happened later. Anyway, Cassius and the other conspirators were all for killing Antony as well, but Brutus put the kibosh on that since Antony was popular and didn't want the assassination to appear too bloodthirsty. This turned out to be a mistake, a big one. Why? Because they allowed Antony to give a public eulogy for Julius Caesar, his friend. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." And Antony cleverly manages to turn the mob against the conspirators, leading to riot and civil war. Antony is no saint here either. He wants power for himself too. He joins up with Octavius, who's next in line, who later became the new emperor. Then there are two big battles which seal the fate of Brutus and the rebels, and Antony declares that Brutus was the most noblest Roman of them all, since Brutus did not kill Caesar for power or personal gain, or out of envy like the others, but simply for the good of Rome. Everything I just told you is true. That's how it all went down in real life, making Shakespeare's plays surprisingly historically accurate. The only liberty he really takes is with the two battles. In real life, they took place several months apart. In the play, the battles happened pretty much on the same day. Otherwise, it was straight up. And it's important to note here that, ironically, Brutus, the noblest Roman of them all, participated in an act that began the eventual downfall of Rome. It kind of started with the murder of Caesar, and that led to a lot of loony emperors taking over, civil wars, and the weakening of the empire. There have been several versions of this play put on film, notably this one from 1953 starring James Mason as Brutus and Marlon Brando as Marc Antony, plus a whole slew of classic Hollywood stars. We also have this version from 1979 put on by the BBC starring Charles Gray as Caesar. Well, I love that one too. My favorite is this here version from 1970 starring the great Charlton Heston. Heston played Marc Antony 3 times in his career. First in a black and white film from 1950 made on the cheap. That one's not so hot. The production was so cheap, they could literally only afford to rent 1 horse a day. Yeah. He later was Marc Antony in Antony and Cleopatra from 1972, a movie he directed himself. That one is sort of meh, frankly. Best stick to Cleopatra with Liz Taylor and Richard Burton for that story. But while I do love the others, the 1970 version of Julius Caesar seems to be my go-to. In our cast, aside from Heston, we have Jason Robards as Brutus. Now, a lot of people, including Robards and Heston, thought he was terribly miscast here. True, he sort of sleepwalks his way through the first half of it, but I gotta say, he's my favorite Brutus out of all the ones I've seen, including James Mason, who I love. John Gielgud is Caesar. Richard Johnston is Cassius, and he is just fantastic as the conspirator. I remember him from an episode of Space 1999. Turns out he was made out of antimatter. Anyway, we also have Robert Vaughn, Richard Chamberlain, Diana Rigg, Michael Gow, Christopher Lee, and others who all crop up in this. Ultimately, at the time, this version of Julius Caesar was a disappointment. Heston blamed the marketing, the budget, the director, and the miscasting of Robards as all being factors. Or maybe it was this dopey costume he has. I don't know, it kind of reminds me of something. I wonder... Oh, yeah! But, problems and all, I still like this one anyway. There's just something about it. It's a little stage-bound, sure, but Heston gives an amazing performance of the speech eulogizing Caesar, which is really the centerpiece of the play. Again, I liked Robards as Brutus and Johnson as Cassius. 1953, 1970, 1979. All of these are good versions of Shakespeare's play, and of course there are others. But all of these have something to recommend them, so you can't go wrong with any of these. The 1953 version is old-school Hollywood at its best. The one from the BBC is the most faithful and accurate version of Shakespeare's play, no surprise there. Plus, it has Charles Gray and Biggs from Star Wars as Octavius, and Silver from Sapphire and Steel as Cassius. He's pretty good Cassius. And this one, the 1970 version with Charlton Heston, I giveth 3 paws uppeth, despite the drawbacks with it. Is it in bad taste to order a Caesar salad on the Ides of March? I don't know, asking for a friend. Anyway, you beware the Ides of March, and I will seeth you in the next one.